All right, Arthur. So you've been pounding on this, on these hickory nuts in this mortar and pestle, and there's what we've got there. So we're breaking it up, and you were talking a little bit to me about the surface area. Can you explain that?
Yeah, in other words, we're trying to make sure that we've broken this up, not into necessarily fine powder, but small enough so that the water can get into all of the recesses of the shell fragments and all around these pieces of kernel that you see in there. And then when we boil it, and it just takes 30 to 45 minutes, we draw out all of those delicious fats that give us this really rich, it's kind of a pecan milk tasting stuff, except here, this is the original, the original pecan, if you will. And this was a milk. We refer to these as nut milks, but the Native American word in the Algonquin language was pauco hicora, and that was their name for these nut milks they made by crushing and boiling. And you can do the same process with hazelnuts, for example, because wild hazelnuts are quite small and very time-consuming to pick through.
Right. Yesterday, you had me pick out, and I use this all right here, and I was trying to pick the meat out of one of these broken kernels like this, and it took me a good 60 seconds to actually clear that nut out. And I mean, I think one of the things that you mentioned was that the actual energy gotten calorically, given, you know, compared to the energy that it would take to get the nuts out, it's not really equal, is it?
Yeah, it's the thing that the traditional cultures, the Aboriginal cultures, had this real wisdom or intuition about food, and they had ways of doing things in an efficient manner. And take the example of choke cherry. You know, we know that the pits of choke cherries contain prunacin and these compounds that contain hydrocyanic acid, and they're damaging to us.
Let's just pause there. I just want to make sure people understand that. So those are cyanide compounds,
Yeah.
and we call it cyanide because if you eat a lot, you basically turn blue because you essentially can't utilize oxygen anymore. Is that right?
Yeah, it's actually damaging respiratory enzymes that you need.
Okay, so there's cyanide in the pit of the cherry and in the bark of the cherry.
That's right.
Okay, so go on. How'd they
Well, the
process?
natives consumed the pits in massive quantities, and this is particularly true of the Plains Indians, who, for them, choke cherry was a staple that they gathered in abundance and ate through the winter. And you can just imagine, you know, you can see this Native American person sitting down, and because they didn't have food mills and strainers and that type of thing, you know, taking the pit out of one. Like,
yeah, the choke cherry is almost all pit and very little fruit.
They simply couldn't have done it. But what they did know is that, or at least they learned, is that the hydrocyanic acid that we're talking about in the pits of these fruits is damaged by heat. So they would dry the fruits and make them into little cakes. They pounded the skins, the flesh, and the pits all together. And the drying would reduce the cyanide content significantly, and then they would cook these on the coals, on the ashes of fires, and the heating of that would further degrade the cyanide-containing compounds, so they would eat these things without suffering any ill effects.
And I've eaten a lot of choke cherries, and I really like the pit more than the fruit, I'd say.
The flavor is so much better when you make a fruit leather and you remove the pits and the skins. It is absolutely bland compared to the ones that the pits are in
The
there.
taste is like bitter almond, or so also the pit of the cherry would contain fats that would increase the caloric content. And the thing I've noticed about wild food is that the search in nature is not for nutrition as much as it's for calories, whereas it's the opposite in our supermarket. There's all kinds of calories and barely any nutrition.
Not much nutrition.
Right. Okay, so we've got these guys broken out of their shells here. And so what's the next step?
Well, we take these out and we put them into a container and heat that container up. And that's what's happening here on the wood stove. And it's just beginning.
Now, I wish you could smell this because it's got the smell of pecan, but yeah, it's slightly different. It's a slightly different smell, but essentially, yeah, really recognizable as pecan. And so that'll just sit in that water and heat up. And how long will that go?
About 30 to 45 minutes is how long I do it. And I'll have this about half filled with the crushed mixture that we've made. And in a very short period of time, that liquid is going to take on a very dilute coffee color. You know, it gets very, very brown with all of those fats. It's just absolutely delicious. Plus, the wonderful thing about Pauco Hicora, the hickory milk here, is that all of the kernel bits float that were liberated from the actual shell, and so you get all of those chunks along with that wonderful fat liquid. So great soup base, or just something to be had as a hot drink on its own.
Right, and drinking it, I was really impressed with it and thought that it would be really fun to blend with some of the superfoods that I use and use it as a base for a lot of the, you know, the kind of elixirs that I'm always using. So it's a good base drink in addition to just being a good drink on its own.
Absolutely.